service capable of calling into our RESTful service using HTTP to get our customers and our states data, we need to take that data and bind it into our data grid that you saw in the application. That's what we're going to work through here. So I'm in a folder called Customers. This is my feature folder for a customer's feature. And I've opened up the customer's component. Now, as a quick review, in the routing that we explored a little bit earlier in the course, we had a route called Customers that goes to Customers Component. So that's where I'm at right now, as I've opened up the Customers Component TS file. Now, this is a pretty standard component. There's nothing really special about it per se. We import all our dependencies that we need. We have our component decorator. We implement on init, which I like to do to make sure I don't have any typos with my ng on init function. And then this is really what's going to kick things off. This is where we're going to get our customers from our data service. You'll notice, though, that first off, I haven't imported data service and I haven't injected it. So that's the first thing we're going to do. And then we're going to use it to get our customers. Now, the UI that ultimately is going to render the customer data, it's going to need the ability to not only get the customers, but also handle filtering the customers. So you'll notice I have a customers property here, and I also have a filtered customers. Now, filtered customers you're going to see is actually what's going to be bound into the UI. But if the user undoes a filter, removes a filter, I want to quickly be able to get back to the original set of customers. So this customers here will never be bound to the UI, but it'll store the original collection of our customers. So we can kind of undo the filter and display all the customers. Now, I could go back to the server and when they undo the filter, make an HTTP call every time, but it seems a little bit unnecessary unless you expect that your data on the server is changing a lot. All right, so the first thing we're going to do before we move on to filling these properties is I need my data service. So let's go ahead and import that. All right, that'll take care of importing it, and then we need to inject it. If you remember earlier, we added a provider for data service into our core module. So now we can inject it and use it. So we'll say private data service of type data service. All right, so we're good to go there. Data service is now available. When this component gets initialized, get customers gets called. That's going to call down to here, and now we need to subscribe to the observable we're going to get back from our data service. Let's go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do is now add in our code to call our data service, call that get customers, and then subscribe. And then I'm also going to show you a little error handling along the way. So we'll say, hey, data service, I would like to get customers. We know we're getting back an observable. If we mouse over that, you'll see observable of iCustomerArray is what we're going to get back. So I'm going to say, let's subscribe. Now, I'm going to get back some customers. We'll say iCustomerArray because we know we're getting back that. And I'm going to make my callback function here. So we'll do our arrow function. Now, I'm going to add a little extra piece. I could stop right there, but if there's an error, we probably do want to log that. So if you put a comma, you can actually add a little error handler. And I'm going to do something very basic here and just log the error. But you could certainly add something more robust. And then if you want a function to run kind of every time, a hey, do this every time type thing, you can also come down and do the following. And actually, before I do that, since I'm not going to end it there, let me get rid of that. And we'll do a console.log. And I'm just going to say get customers was called. It retrieved customers, or maybe it got an error, I guess. And then we'll end our parens here for our subscribe. So now we have a way to have a success callback. That's our first area. An error callback if there's an error as we subscribe. And then a, hey, let's just write this out every time to the console so we can get some visual feedback here in the console if we'd like. Now what I need to do is take these customers and assign them up into the individual properties up here. So let's go ahead and do that. Pretty simple. So we'll say customers is the same as filtered customers, at least when it first loads. And those are both equal to customers. And that should take care of it. Now let me save, go back to my terminal window, and it looks like some changes were watched for, and I don't see any errors there. So it looks like we're pretty good to go. All right, so that's kind of the first stage. We now have customers that are available. Now, if I go into the template, you would probably expect that the template for this component must have something that binds to filtered customers. Well, let's go look. So this is the template, and you won't actually see filtered customers in here anywhere except for right here. So I could have put the grid functionality certainly right here, but I decided to build a child component called customers grid, and we'll look at that next. But it has an input property called customers, and that's actually what accepts our filtered customers. Now, to reiterate, customers back in the customers component is the raw data we get. Filtered customers is either the raw data or the filtered data, because the user could interact with our UI, of course. So we're going to send this guy down into our child component, and that's going to have a property we'll look at in a moment called customers. All right, so let's go ahead now and let's see what we have going on in that component. So here's my customers grid component, and if I open it up, you'll notice I have an input property, so I've imported that. An input property, if you're new to this, is basically a way to pass a data-bound property from a parent down to the child. And so now I'm saying, hey, you can pass me something of type iCustomerArray, and I start off with just an empty array. Now, it doesn't do a lot more than that. It does have some sorting capability. I'll show you the basics of that as we move along, but other than that, nothing real fancy here. Now, one thing I do in this scenario where I have input properties, the only time this would ever need to be checked for the change detection mechanism that Angular 2 has built in is if the input property changes. I don't have an output event. I don't have anything else special. I just want to detect this and re-render the UI for changes if the customers changes. Now, if the customers change, then certainly I would like to push those changes out. So you'll notice I'm actually using a change detection mechanism, or strategy they call it, of on push. Now, that's certainly not the default, which is just default if you put nothing. That would mean it always gets checked for changes. We're only going to detect it for changes in this example anyway, if this property is changing the data, the array changes, for instance. So that's a nice little performance characteristic you can add when you have these child components that only have input properties, and you only want the change detector to have to worry about this if that input property changes. Now, other than that, it does a little bit of sorting. There's a sorter service I have that can sort the customers as they click on the header for the data grid. I won't go into that here, but that's all in the code. I also have something called a track by service that's being injected, and I'll talk about what that does here in just a moment as well. All right, so now that we've seen that, let's go ahead and leave it as it was. Let's go into our customers grid component HTML. And you'll see this is a pretty standard set of table tags. Now, I could have used divs or whatever, but this was tabular data, so I went with just a table type approach. So you'll notice up top that when the header rows are clicked, I call the sort function that you saw back in here. That calls in, passes the property to sort, and that calls the sorter service, and then it actually sorts the customer data. So you'll see that in action as we move along here. Other than that, all I'm doing in the table body is simply rendering some rows for all the customers. So pretty basic. So all I'm going to do here to get the data loaded is we need to add our ng4 directive to loop through those customers in the input property. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do an ng4, and I'm going to say, let's make a customer variable as we loop through of customers. I'm going to add a track by. We're going to be tracking by the customer. Now, let me show you a little bit on the track by real quick. So if we go into the core and we go to the track by service, you'll notice that there's this customer call here. That's the one I just wrote the code for. It always passes in the index of the item we're looping through and then the object we're actually looping through. Now, I'm saying that I would like to uniquely track each of the items being added by the customer's _ID. This is something that comes from MongoDB. It's the unique identifier. So if you're new to track by, this is a great way if you have data that's being added and removed or modified in any way in a table or divs or whatever it may be. By adding a track by, you can really enhance the DOM manipulation. Instead of having to kind of delete all the rows and then re-add them every time, it can just selectively update the appropriate rows as needed. So it adds some efficiency here. So track by is the object injected into my component constructor, and then customer is the actual function I just showed you that returns the unique identifier. I could have said the index, the 0, 1, 2 was the unique identifier, and that would work too, but since every customer has a unique identifier, we're going to use that. All right, now you'll see I'm already using this a little bit, so I render the customer gender to render the image. And then what I'm going to do for the rest of this is just grab some snippet code to kind of overwrite what I have in here currently. And we'll paste that in. And all I'm going to do is bind in the first name. I'm going to run that through a capitalized pipe, which is a custom pipe I have. If you're interested in that, you can go into the shared pipes and learn about a capitalized pipe there. I also have a trim pipe in there. But we'll write out the first name, the last name, the address, the city, the state name, and there's the order total we talked about. If you remember, the data service would give us an order total. All right, so we're kind of ready to go there. We now have said that what we want to look at, which is our customers. Our customers, of course, represent our input property. That's being passed in through the parent. Really, it's just filtered customers. And then we hopefully are off and running. So let's go back. And don't see any errors here, so that's a good start. So let's go ahead and open this up in the browser, and I already have this open to 3000. Let me refresh, and it looks good. Now you'll see that all the customers are being displayed. I have no pagination, no paging at all going on right now. I don't have a lot going on for clicking on these. Let's try out the filter though. Okay, it looks like that is working correctly, and then I mentioned their sorting capability. And it looks like that's working correctly. So we now have successfully retrieved the data from the customer's RESTful service that we have with Node.js and Express. We did that with our data service. Data service was injected into our customer's component, and now we're kind of off and running. And we're going to do quite a bit of enhancing of this, but this is a good start. Now let's move into the actual form so we can edit our customers. Our next step in this process is to grab a single customer from the RESTful service and integrate it into an Angular form. And that's what we're going to look at in this particular section. So if we go back to the browser, we can click on a customer currently, and if you look down at the very bottom, you'll notice that a customer ID is being passed. That's the unique identifier from MongoDB. And when I click on it, it does navigate to the route, but it looks like we have some broken aspects here. So we're going to fix this and retrieve that customer and display it. And along the way, I'm going to show you some of the different form features that are available when it comes to working with Angular. All right, so let's minimize that and come back in. I've already opened up the customer edit component TS and the HTML. Now, this is very much like any component you'll open. I import the dependencies I need. You'll notice data service is already available in this case because we've already seen that, and it's already being injected. So we're good to go there. But I also have some other things we're going to talk about really quickly, like getting to the route parameter, the :ID. If we go back to the routes, you'll notice I have this customers :ID so that we can load customer edit component. That's what we're going to do here. So I need to be able to grab that off of the route. We're going to talk about how to do that. And then we'll grab the customer and display it in the form and work a little bit with a template form. All right, so if we come on down, I have an initial customer. This will be used a little bit later as we do insert operations. We have the data service as mentioned, but I want to jump to here. When we initialize the component, I'm going to grab the route, and this is called an activated route. You'll see it's imported from Angular Router. This represents the current route that we're on. And what I'm going to do is say, hey, let's go to that route, grab a snapshot of the current route parameters named ID. And then that ID will be the value that we have from MongoDB, hopefully, assuming that it's passed correctly. And if it doesn't equal 0 or something else like that, then we're going to say this is an update operation, and that we're going to need to get a customer now based on that ID. And that's what we're going to be after. Now, it also triggers a HTTP call back to the server to get states, because those are now going to be used in the form. There's a drop down you'll see, and that code is already hooked up. So we call data service get states, subscribe to the states, and we simply bind those to the states property. So pretty basic. So now what we need to do is we need the ability to get our customer. So we saw how to write the RESTful side of this. Let's now use the data service that has a get customer function as well. So we're going to come into our data service and say, hey, let's get a customer based on the ID. And of course, we want to subscribe to that value. So let's subscribe, and I'm going to get back a customer, hopefully. I've already imported the interface for it. And then I'm going to do a little bit of tweaking of the data here. I'm going to do a little cloning, and we're going to do it a quick and dirty way. But before I do that, let's add an error handler, and we'll just log out the error. All right, so that'll take care of subscribing and then just logging out an error if we do happen to get one. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to clone the customer so that if they kind of leave, it doesn't mess up any other parts of the system. There's a quick and dirty way to do this, which it works. I'm going to just stringify the existing customer we get, and then I'm going to assign it up to a customer property, and you'll see that customer property right here. We're going to override the default value. You'll see right there. So let's assign that to json.parse cust. And again, the only reason I'm doing this is by making a copy of the customer. Now any changes I make won't affect the original one that was passed in. Now in this case it won't matter, but if I was doing dirty checking, things like that, it may matter. And this will allow us to just get a true copy of the data. There's certainly other ways to do that, but that's a quick and easy way. All right, so now we should have a customer bound into this property here called customer up top. And so we're good to go there. So we have a way to get the customer based on the ID that's passed in. We pluck that off the route. We have a way to load the states, subscribe to that. Of course, and I haven't really mentioned this up to this point, but because we're using a built-in Angular observable that HTTP does, we don't have to worry about unsubscribing. It'll take care of that for us on both of these. So we're good to go. All right, so the next phase is let's come into the component, and we actually want to work with a form. Now I'm going to show you two ways to do forms in this app. This first one is a template-driven approach, and then we'll also look at a reactive forms approach. So for a template-driven approach, you end up putting more code into your actual template. Very little code related to the form actually goes into here. We just get the customer, bind it, and then the rest of the data binding happens inside of the actual template itself. Now with the other approach I'm going to show you, it's kind of reversed. But in this case, what I'm going to do is come up to the form, and we need to hook in some Angular features. So for instance, when they submit it, I'm going to use the ng submit directive. And I'm going to bind that to a function that you would have seen back in the component class called submit. And I'm also going to add a local template variable. Let's just call it customer form, since that's what it is. I'm going to bind that to the ng form directive. Now that's going to give us the ability to check if the form's valid, invalid, if it's been touched, if it's dirty, those types of things. Now, why am I doing this if you're new to it? Well, first off, this will make it so when they submit, it doesn't do a full page postback. This will let Angular intercept the submission process, and that's just simply going to call back to submit, and then we'll talk more about that later as we get into our put and post type operations that we'll be with on the RESTful side. This is being added simply so we have a way to get to all the details about the status or state of the form. Again, we can check if it's been touched or interacted with, in other words. We can check if it's dirty, meaning the data has changed. We can check if it's valid or invalid, and so on and so forth. Really nice. Now, other than that, I'm using a Bootstrap CSS class, and I'm telling the browser, don't do any of your validation features. Now, the next thing we're going to do, and I'm only going to do this on one of them because it's a very repetitive process in the template form world. We have an input, but right now we don't know what property that's bound to, but you can probably guess it's going to be first name. So I'm going to come in, and first off, we have to put a name attribute in this world. So I'm going to say name, and we simply put the name that I want this to represent, first name. That's the property I'm ultimately going to bind to. Now, to do the data binding, we're going to do the input and output with an NG model. So some people call this banana in a box or football in a box, whatever you like to call it. But of course, the square brackets mean data is going to come in. The parentheses mean data can go out. So we simulate a two-way data binding. And I'm going to bind this to customer first name. Now, I also need to know if this NG model, which is bound to first name, if it's been touched or is dirty or is valid or invalid. And the way we're going to do that is by making a local template variable called first name and assign it to NG model. So this is literally just going to be an alias for our NG model directive. It lets us get to some of the properties and functions if I wanted to. And then I'm going to say that this is required. Now, the reason we're doing the name is that's a requirement, first off. You need to use that when you're working with template forms and input controls. We're doing NG model for the two-way data binding to bind to first name of the customer. And then we're doing this hash or pound first name, the local template variable, so that we can get to NG model functionality, properties, and functions. So an example of that is with my error message. We're going to hide this if first name is untouched, because they haven't interacted yet with it, so there's no reason to show an error, or it's valid. Now, if it's any other condition, if it's been touched, and then they find that it's invalid, then first name is required is going to show. And so this will let me get to the touched, untouched, valid, invalid, dirty, pristine, those types of things. And this first name here, this actually represents that guy right there. All right, so that's kind of how we can hook in. Now, there's a lot more we could do, but you're going to see that all of the different form tags, let me give ourselves a little more room here, are going to be the same. So for last name, I have a name, I have an NG model that binds two-way, and I have a last name local template variable, and then it's doing the exact same thing here. Now, this would certainly be an opportunity potentially to write a reusable component or something to show and hide the error message. Same thing here, I have gender on a radio button. We'll run this in a moment. I'm doing the exact same type of thing you'll see. The difference here is name is going to be the same because it's a radio button. So I only want you to be able to select one of them. We have an email, an address that are the same, a city, and then state's a little bit different because it is a select. So you'll notice I'm binding to the customer state ID, which is something that comes back from the database. And the name is state, and it's required. But to actually get the options, I'm using this ng4 to loop through the states that we got. You saw the states property in the component. And then I'm going to use an ng value directive. We're going to bind that to the state's ID. And that'll basically hook up that to the state ID here so that if they've already selected the state for a customer, it displays in the dropdown. Now, other than that, we have some functionality down here, which we'll get to later, to show and hide a deletion message and do things like that. But I do want to show the button to submit here. You'll notice it's disabled if not customer form is valid. So this is a nice and easy way to use the customer form local template variable I defined right here. Again, that's just an alias for ng form. And all we're doing is saying, I would like to disable that button if it's not valid. Why would you be able to submit the form, if they haven't filled everything out? Let's go ahead and save our work here. Let's go on back. Now that we have our component, let's start from the beginning. So let me load this. Refresh to make sure we picked up those changes. And let's try to navigate to Marcus. All right, perfect. So now notice that we see the ID up top. I showed you how we can grab a snapshot of that, pluck it off the URL. We then go to the RESTful service with our data service in Angular 2. That loads the customer, and then we updated the customer property, which is then bound using the ng model directive to each of the text boxes and things like that. Now later we'll talk about how to make the update and the delete and things like that work, but hey, we have a good start. We have our states are loading. The selected state for each customer looks like is working. If I cancel, I can go. This should show California, for instance. Let's look, and it looks like that's working. So we're off and running here. So now we have all the get operation code in place. We have our customers, we have our states, and now we're able to select that single customer So now we can start to move forward to other aspects. But before we do that, we're going to look at another option for building out forms. In a previous section, I showed how we can take data from a component and bind it into a form using a template-driven approach. Now, in that particular approach, we're using ng-model to do the data binding and get data in and out of the form. But the template-driven approach isn't the only game in town. We can also use a reactive forms approach. So what I'm going to show you is just a quick look at what that type of code would look like. So going back into the customers folder, in addition to the customer edit component, which has our template-driven approach for forms, I also have a customer edit reactive. Now, for the customer edit, we used ng-model. So if I go down into our shared module, we needed forms module to be imported to get to ng-model. You'll also notice that I've imported reactive forms module though as well, and this is going to give us this alternative approach for binding data and getting data in and out of our forms. So if we go into the HTML, you'll notice some different things going on up top. We still have an ng-submit. Now, the way the submit is being called is a little bit different, so I'll talk about that. But we also have this new directive we're binding to called form group. Now, this gets us into our reactive forms. So before I dive into the form and more details here, let's go into the code for the component. And right up top, you'll notice that I'm importing some reactive forms objects. We have form builder, form group, and validators. Then I also have some custom validators in this validation service. Now, if we move on down, everything looks very similar until we get right here. So first off, we have something called a form group. Now, customer form is my variable. It's of type form group. Now, this is an object that's going to have all the different form controls that I want to bind into the template. But we're not going to be doing it using ng-model with this approach. So let me jump on down to ng on init and I'll show you. So first off, we still have to get our customer based on the ID from the route. We still need our states for the dropdown. That part doesn't change, but you'll notice this call to build form. Now this is where we get into our reactive forms approach. So what I'm going to do is use the form builder, which you'll see is injected right here into my constructor. And this is going to allow me to build a group of form controls. Now, I could actually new up a form control instance, but this is a shortcut way to give an object literal. And then these are the names of the different controls. So I have my first name, last name, gender, and my kind of standard things I need in the form. Now, you'll notice that the value here in this array, the first value is going to be, do I want to assign a default value to this form control? I do. I want to say, take whatever customer first name is and bind it. Now, when it first loads, customer first name is just going to be empty, and you'll see all of these are empty. But once we get the customer, we'll update that. So this first value will be, what's the default value? And then you put a comma, and then you can define as many validators for this particular form control as you would like. Now, most of these are just required, except for email. You notice email, I have an array of validators. And it's not only required, but I have an email validator. Now that just does a regular expression check and make sure it's a valid email address. Now the rest of this all looks the same though. You notice it's kind of very repetitive. Now what's nice about this is I'm able to define not only all the validators and default values, but all the form controls in code. So I could actually build these up dynamically if I needed to. Now I don't need to in this case, but I could. Maybe you have to do a questionnaire and a lot of the form control data is in a database, and you don't want to hard code what that is going to look like into the template itself. You want to make these form controls and then have validators based on what the database says you should have. Well, we can do that here. Now, what's going to happen is once we get the customer, I'm going to call this build form again, and now customer is actually going to have a value for first name, last name, gender, assuming it was found. And then we'll go ahead and use that and bind it into the form. Now we also have a way to get the value as they submit it. So when they pass in the value, this is going to pass in a form group I'll show you in a moment. We can also check not only the value and get to that, but we can also say, is this valid? Now, we'll talk more about this code a little later as we get into the put and post operations. So we'll need to handle that separately as we build out our RESTful service. Now, that's about it. This is the key part of the reactive forms. You actually build up these form controls, define any default values, and define any validators. Now what I need to do is this form builder group, this actually builds a form group. You'll see that up top there in the IntelliSense. So this is of type form group. It's a group of form controls. Now what I need to do is hook that into the form. And the way we do that is using the form group directive. We bind it with our square bracket syntax. And then we bind it to that property I just showed you, customer form. That is the definition of all the form controls. Now that's the first step. Now where things get really nice with this reactive forms model is notice how clean my input tag is. I don't have to put a name. I don't have a local template variable. I don't have to put ng model. I just put form control name, and this first name here actually is referencing that entire control right there. It's not actually referencing the customer first name. It's referencing this first name, which is a control, and that references the customer's first name and has the validators. So notice I don't even have to put required on this. It's going to be added automatically through this reactive forms model. So this is really clean now, and that's the case for all of these. They're very, very simple. You'll notice all these form controls going on down. In fact, even the select is very simple. Now, I still do have to loop through all the states and things, but other than that, it's very, very similar to what you saw earlier. And then everything down below is pretty much the same. Now, what's different, though, is notice if we go, for instance, to the first name error message here. So if I scroll over a bit, we have first name is required. Now, this is a little bit longer, but it's only because we don't have to put the local template variable, so it's actually kind of nice. I'm saying let's go to customer form, which is exposed to me as a variable I can get to throughout this form. Go to its controls collection, go to its first name control, which again is this guy right here, which has this required on it, and see if that control has been, if it's untouched or if it's valid. Now likewise, if I go to the very bottom here to where the button is submitted, I can also go to customer form and see if the form as a whole, the form group, is valid. And if it's not, we can disable the button. And then we'll talk about some of these other aspects as we move along in the course. So this is the reactive forms approach. You use the form builder to build up a form group of controls. Then you use the directive here called form control name to actually bind to the name of that control that's been defined, and then it kind of takes over from there and handles the data binding. Now the last piece is you don't have the two-way data binding here with the customer. So customer is not automatically going to get updated as they type into the text box as it did with the template-driven form and ng model. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to pass the customer form, the form group of the controls, into submit. And then I've already shown what happens there. When submit is called, we can then destructure some of the properties it gives us access to. I can get to the actual value of the form, and that allows me to get to the different values like the zip, the first name, the last name, and those types of things. And I'll show how that's used a little bit later. And then I can also check if the form is valid or not. So this is a totally different approach, but this is another option in Angular 2, and definitely a worthwhile option to explore. Now there's other courses on Pluralsight that go into more details. This is certainly not a forms course, but now you've seen both techniques for working with data that comes from our Node.js Express RESTful service. We've made a lot of great progress so far. We now have a RESTful service that's capable of accepting GET requests up to the service with Node.js and Express, and we can return our customers, a single customer, and some states. We've also looked at an Angular service and how it can provide reusable functionality and use HTTP and observables to call up to the service, get that data, and then through observables provide that to components in the application. Then we've also looked at how we can data bind our data into our components, such as our grid, and how we can use different form techniques, including a template-driven approach and the reactive forms approach. So now that you've seen how to get the data from the RESTful service and integrate that into Angular, let's move forward and see how we can start to modify that data. As you're working with data, you'll reach a point where you need to insert that data into some type of a data source. So in this module, we're going to talk about posting data and how we can handle a